Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. Maggie and RJ had a good marriage, except for one thing. In fact, Maggie and RJ had an amazing marriage, except for one thing. They had been together for almost 9 years, married for 6, and they were still very much in love. They enjoyed spending time together, talking to each other. In fact, each would say that the other was the most interesting person I know. Love was great. Some weeks it was only once. Other weeks it was 3 times or more, depending on how each of them felt and whether RJ was on business trips. But whenever they did, they had a good time. So they had their favorite poses, but they also liked to experiment sometimes. But most importantly, everyone still found each other very attractive, and their lovemaking was passionate and enjoyable. They enjoyed spending time with each other's families. RJ's parents died, but Maggie loved spending time with her older brother David, his wife, and their 2 children. And RJ was happy when Maggie's parents came from California, or when he and Maggie flew there to see them. Maggie couldn't have children, but they were both fine with it. They loved being an aunt and uncle to David's children, and meeting Maggie's cousins from time to time. But RJ has been on business trips a lot, as a technical representative for a medical instrument manufacturing company, and it would be difficult to be the father he would like to be while continuing his work. Maggie worked as the executive secretary of the chief operating officer of a manufacturing company. After 8 years of work, she knew the place better, was counted on in everything, and was well paid. So they were quite happy, much happier, of course, than many married couples. Except for one thing. It was Maggie's character. Maggie is short for Margaret O'Connor Sullivan. She was of Irish blood, since her parents were also Irish. Her character corresponded to the Irish fiery temperament. All she needed was red hair. She had jet black hair that matched her face and bright blue eyes perfectly. She was a beauty, as RJ never tired of saying. But she was a handful, as he said only quietly, and never when Maggie was around. RJ sometimes wondered that a loving woman like Maggie, so sweet, generous, attentive, and affectionate, could turn into a mad woman so quickly. Her temper tantrums weren't frequent, but they were frightening. The worst period was during their engagement, when there were several quarrels that prompted him to think seriously. One of them happened on Friday evening, when he was late at work due to an emergency meeting and forgot to tell her. He was more than 2 hours late for dinner, apologizing as quickly as he could. The baked minced chicken she cooked was overcooked and almost inedible. The mashed potatoes were cold, the salad was sluggish, and Maggie had an apoplexy. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter that he was sorry. It didn't matter that he swore it would never happen again. Nothing mattered. Maggie screamed. She scolded him, and when her rage reached its peak, she grabbed a rolling pin and threw it at him. Fortunately, he ducked and avoided a head injury, but the rolling pin smashed the glass cabinet door, scattering shards of glass all over the kitchen. RJ looked at her in horror, but she didn't apologize or admit that she had gone too far, shouted that he was a dumb fucking asshole, and stormed out of the room. A few seconds later, the slamming door announced that she had also left RJ's apartment. He had more than an hour to collect the broken windows and cook himself a dinner from the leftovers of the cold food before she returned. They didn't say a word that night, and RJ was sleeping on the couch. The next day, Maggie apologized to him, sincerely with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, darling. I know you weren't late on purpose. It's just that I was so excited that I cooked us a real dinner, the good things that married people eat. And then I was so disappointed when you didn't come to eat it. I started pacing, and the more I waited, the angrier I got." RJ held her, kissed her, apologized again for not calling, and soon they were in bed, resuming their feelings with very sweet love. 4 months before the wedding, there was another breakdown, in which even RJ was not to blame. They had dinner with Eileen Anderson and her husband on Friday night. Eileen was Maggie's best friend from work, and on the way to the restaurant, Maggie told RJ all about the plans she and some others were making for Eileen's big 30th birthday party. Unfortunately, the party was supposed to be a surprise, and Maggie didn't tell RJ to keep quiet. While they were sitting and waiting for snacks, RJ said, "Eileen, I heard your birthday party is going to be a big celebration. Maggie told me all about it." All he had in mind was a pleasant conversation, but the evening ended in a hurry. Eileen looked at him blankly, and Maggie screamed at him in a voice that could be heard in the restaurant. "You're a damn idiot. It was a pleasant surprise. I can't believe you said that." She got up, poured her glass of wine on RJ's sports jacket, and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving her stunned husband and equally stunned friends looking after her, while the whole room was full of shocked customers watching everything that happened. That night, RJ didn't even return to the apartment he shared with Maggie. He went to sleep with a friend and didn't return home until noon on Saturday, not knowing what to expect. Maggie sat in the kitchen and looked at him coldly. She was no longer hysterical, but she was still terribly upset and wouldn't even let RJ speak first. "It's okay, I'm calm now. But honestly, RJ, you have to be the biggest idiot in the world." "Maggie, I think we need to reconsider the wedding." "What? After you? Just listen to me. First of all, it wasn't my fault. You never told me that Eileen's party was a secret, so how could I know that?" Maggie stared at him, and then her face started to turn red when she realized what she had done. After a long silence, she said softly, "Oh, RJ, I am like that. It doesn't matter. Even if it was my fault, your reaction was completely out of control. You were crazy. But RJ, But nothing. What you did was unbearable. It was unacceptable. Maggie, I've never loved anyone as much as you, but if you don't go to anger management counseling, I'm canceling the engagement." She gasped again, and he said, "Please think about it. I'm going to have dinner out. I have to be home by about 8:30. Looking her straight in the face, he added, "I mean every word I say." Then he turned around and left the apartment. When RJ returned after dinner, he found another person there. Maggie was crying, confused and scared. She clung to him, wouldn't let go of his hand, apologized over and over again. "You're right. Sometimes I get out of control. I'm so sorry, darling. And I'll go for what you want me to see. Just don't give up, please." RJ was pleased and relieved. He held her, kissed her, comforted her, and then they made love for half the night, bathing each other in caresses and tenderness. The following week, Maggie began a 12-week anger management program. The course was found through the HR department at RJ twice a week. She went for 2 hours to a group therapy class with 9 other people, which was headed by a middle-aged social worker named Roberta Simmons. They told each other their stories, did exercises for refocusing and even for deep breathing, and learned a lot from each other about their problems. At home, Maggie repented and loved RJ. The class helped her better understand how outrageous her behavior was and strengthened her resolve not to let it happen again. When the course ended and the social worker told Maggie that she had done well, she went straight home, apologized to RJ one last time, and dragged him to bed early. Needless to say, RJ was delighted with her success, and the wedding went as planned. And in the years of their marriage, Maggie had never gone as far as she had during their engagement. That doesn't mean there were never any problems, but Maggie didn't throw things at RJ anymore. But there were still skirmishes from time to time. The difference was that, usually, Maggie could remember what she had learned from the program and stop, shorting out the emotional spiral before she completely lost control. But when RJ forgot something, or let her down, or hurt her feelings, he could count on his wife to do something unpleasant. Sometimes her tirade was followed by hours or even a day or two of cold relations. Needless to say, RJ didn't like it either. He knew that he was far from perfect himself. Sometimes he was absent-minded, and he could seem detached and uninformed when he had something on his mind. But he wanted his wife to be able to cope with the daily frustrations of life, without tantrums. It was a Friday night in January when everything went to hell. RJ worked very hard, tried to help close the territory of an incompetent sales representative in his company, who was fired, and he was traveling more often than usual. Needless to say, Maggie didn't like it at all. So this Friday, they set up a special date, dinner and dancing at one of the best restaurants in Columbus. She bought a new outfit, he dry cleaned his best suit and shined his shoes. And he promised not to let anything stop him from picking her up that night, even though, as it turned out, he would be in Louisville that morning. "Yes, dear, I know it's 200 miles of road," he said on the phone from his hotel the night before. "But I promised you, and I'll be there for dinner, believe me." What happened was really not RJ's fault. He nearly drove himself crazy to complete his shopping calls in Louisville by 12 p.m., after which he grabbed a sandwich and jumped into the car. Under good conditions, he will be home by 3:30 or 4 o'clock. So even with the bad weather and traffic jams on Friday, he will have enough time to shower and change before they go to dinner at 7:30. But RJ did not count on an accident. On U.S. Route 71 North, just past the exit to Route 3, The driver of the big 18-wheeler bus braked sharply to avoid a collision with some idiot in a red pickup truck who cut him off, and the huge truck skidded on an icy section and abruptly turned into the path of the Toyota RJ. He had absolutely no choice: to turn off the road onto the side of the road, or crash into the bottom of a truck, which could well take off the top of his car, and with it his head. So he swerved, and when his car left the highway, the front right wheel fell into a pothole near the asphalt, and the car rolled over several times, sliding down an embankment before crashing into a pine tree. RJ was strapped in, and he didn't die, but he lost consciousness and the overturned car folded around him. Several drivers used their mobile phones to call the emergency service, and within 30 minutes a rescue team arrived. But it immediately became clear that they would pull him out in a couple of hours. Maggie didn't worry about RJ until 5:45. She was absolutely sure that he would return, and in fact she expected him much earlier. But it was only when the time approached 6 that she began to worry. She came home from work early to take a shower, curl her hair, paint her nails, and generally get dressed for their special evening. And when 5:45 became 6 o'clock, and then 6:15, and then 6:30, her anxiety began to turn into boiling anger. He couldn't forget her tonight, could he? If there had been a serious delay, he would have called. If only, unless he was an idiot to even look her in the eye, knowing that he would break his promise. At 6:20, she called him on his cell phone for the first time. He immediately went to voicemail, and she cursed. Of course, she couldn't have known that the phone had flown out of RJ's shirt pocket and was lying crushed among the wreckage of the Corolla. She called back every 10 minutes, first hanging up the phone every time she received his voice message, then finally leaving a sharp message clearly showing how furious she was. It was around 7 o'clock when she was sitting at the kitchen table, dressed and made up and looking as beautiful as she could. After a few minutes, a sudden thought stopped the rising tide of her anger. She gasped and grabbed the phone book. What if he had been in an accident? But someone would have called, wouldn't they? She turned on the local news on the TV, turned down the sound, and started calling all the local hospitals. It took her 25 minutes to find out that none of the 11 hospitals she called had received any casualties that day. Okay, there was actually a victim in one hospital, but she was a teenage girl who complained of a headache, nothing to do with RJ. While she didn't find him in all the hospitals, Maggie searched all the local news for information about car accidents. Oddly enough, all branches of the local network published short stories about the RJ disaster, based on footage taken from a helicopter belonging to WSYX Channel 6, an ABC affiliate. But they launched them at different times. When Maggie was watching ABC, the footage was shown on NBC, and so on. If she had left the TV on only one channel, she would have seen her husband's badly dented car. By 7:30, now convinced that nothing had happened to RJ, Maggie was furious again. That bastard stayed late to make sales calls, and now he was afraid to look at her face. She angrily threw her purse on the kitchen table to find her cell phone. Maybe he left her a message there. But there were no messages on the phone, no new missed calls. In a rage, she threw him through the doorway into the living room, where he flew under the sofa. Maggie burst into the bathroom to take one last look at her hair, then returned to the kitchen, stuffed everything back into her purse, and headed for the door. If this asshole was going to stay late tonight, she wasn't going to stay at home and wait for him. Maggie had just backed out of the car when the phone rang in the house. It was a woman named Alice Burns, the operator of Riverside Hospital, the 10th hospital Maggie had called. Alice told Maggie that they had no accident victims that day. But just a few moments later, Alice received a call, and she referred them to the emergency department. The victim of the accident was taken because of the crash on Highway 71. She immediately checked the call log and dialed Maggie's number. But of course, Maggie left, so Alice left a message. At first, Maggie didn't know where she was going. She was too crazy to think. But then she decided, damn it, I'm dressed and I look great. I'll find a place to drink, dance with strange guys, and have fun. To hell with RJ, that inconsiderate bastard. She immediately became a star in mint ultra lung. It was high-end enough that her smart dress didn't seem completely out of place, and Maggie was more than beautiful enough to provide her with a lot of male attention. Within an hour, she accepted offers of drinks from Brad, Michael, and Andre, and danced with each of them, as well as a couple of others. Maggie's attention was blurred, and the fact that she forgot to have lunch meant that she got drunk much faster than she wanted to. Actually, she wasn't going to get drunk at all, was she? She couldn't remember how out of breath she was from dancing and laughing with so many guys. All she was sure of was that she wasn't going to stay at home wondering where her snake husband was. At about 10:15 a.m., it occurred to her to check her cell phone to see if RJ finally bothered to call her. But for some reason, it wasn't in her purse. So she stopped worrying about it and drank another vodka stinger with Michael, snacking on peanuts. He was sitting next to her, his knees pressed against hers at a small table, pressing his lips to her cheek every minute and making her giggle when she pushed him away. He's a sweet but stupid boy, she thought. She remembered that one more glass would be the last for her, but another one was brought, in the hand of a pretty blonde waitress. Where did he come from? Have a just, kid, he replied, raising his glass. They touched glasses and drank. After a few minutes, Maggie's eyes closed and she rested her head on Michael's shoulder while he hugged her, gently stroking up and down her arm. It was good. She felt wonderful, relaxed, contented. She realized that she wasn't even angry anymore. She let out only a small protesting whisper as Michael stood up, lifted her from her chair and led her to the door of the club, putting his arm around her waist. RJ drove to Riverside Hospital by ambulance at 7:42 p.m. He was in serious condition, with a moderate head injury, a broken ankle, a broken arm, 4 cracked ribs, and various bruises. He was unconscious, very cold and in shock, but stable. The attending doctor of the emergency department took one look at him and ordered a blood transfusion and a neurologist's consultation and sent him to the intensive care unit. It took more than 3 hours to cut RJ out of the car, and until he was pulled out, no one knew who he was. The first few minutes in the ambulance were spent trying to stabilize his position and determine the extent of his injuries. It was only when they arrived at the hospital that the paramedic took RJ's wallet out of his pants pocket and found out his name. RJ's phone calls to Maggie's home number began at 7:46 a.m., about 9 minutes after Alice Burns's first text message. Hospital staff called at least once an hour until 2 a.m., leaving several messages when no one answered the call. Starting at 22 o'clock, hospital staff also called Maggie's mobile phone, finding the number on a piece of paper in RJ's wallet. But they did not receive a response there either, and left several messages. Since the hospital did not know about any other next of kin, they stopped making phone calls. Instead, the staff of the intensive care unit devoted themselves to ensuring that RJ remained alive. Maybe Maggie was woken up by the phone ringing, but she wasn't sure. She thought she remembered hearing that, but it could have been a bad dream. God, she has a headache. Light streamed into the room. She lifted her head a little and saw that the bedside clock showed 9:24. She sank down again, moaning, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, it was 10:05. This time she noticed that she was still in yesterday's dress, and it all began to come back to her. RJ standing on her feet, drinking and dancing. Michael. My God, Michael. What did she do? She jumped out of bed and staggered a little, grabbing the night table to keep from falling. Where the hell was RJ? She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her hair was in disarray, her makeup was caked on her face, the bodice of her dress was torn, and her tights were gone. First things first, Maggie thought, desperately trying to keep the panicked thoughts swirling in her head. Home. Where was RJ? She looked around and nothing had changed in the bedroom. She walked unsteadily through the house and found no signs of his return. His car wasn't in the driveway. Okay, she thought. Don't panic, don't worry. Coffee shower, and then think about what's next. She started the coffee maker and headed for the bathroom. She washed herself with hot water. She tried to put everything together. RJ never called or came home. She went out to dance and drink. She got drunk, very drunk. And she let a guy she'd never met take her to a motel room across from the bar and use her. In fact, he started using it, but he was so drunk, even more drunk than Maggie, that he couldn't. She screamed at him. Although she was drunk, she was furious, but he passed out on the bed. She remembered finding a taxi on the street in front of the bar, but everything else was empty. Obviously, she got home safely because she was here, but she didn't remember it at all. In a bathrobe and with a towel wrapped around her wet hair, she was sitting at the kitchen table. 2 cups of hot coffee, a few aspirin pills, and a piece of toast made her head ache a little less. She noticed that the answering machine was blinking and immediately jumped up. Oh, it was a mistake, her head screamed. There were 9 messages, all from Riverside Hospital, but she didn't hear a word after the first one. RJ was injured. My God, what's wrong with him? Unconscious? She ran into the bedroom, dressed hastily, and spent a few moments brushing her hair before grabbing her keys and heading for the door. Please don't let him die. Please don't let him die. Her car wasn't in front of the house. Shit. She was still standing at the Ultra Mint salon. She called a taxi, told them it was urgent, then listened to phone messages again while waiting for a taxi for 13 terrifying minutes. What did she do? What did she do? RJ Renshert, the gray-haired woman at the front desk, said, "Let me see, here it is. He's upstairs in the intensive care unit. 4th floor, turn left when exiting the elevator." My God, how bad is he? Maggie was furious. It says they're serious but stable. The woman smiled reassuringly. It's going to be okay, honey. Thank you, she said as she ran to the elevators. Maggie stood over RJ's bed in horror. He was unconscious. Half of his head was wrapped in bandages. Various IVs and tubes ran from the devices to the body. His left leg was in a cast below the knee and hung above the bed in a noose. A minute later, the doctor on duty joined her at RJ's bedside. He led her into the hallway, asked her to sit down, gently, quietly. He was in an accident on Highway 71 yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Renshert. A truck clipped him, I think. He is now in stable condition, although, as you can see, he is unconscious. He has a broken ankle and a broken arm, but they're both healing fine. The main problem now is a head injury. Often patients with such injuries recover quickly within a few days, but we just won't know how serious the injury is until he wakes up. His EEG shows no fundamental damage, but this is less important than the clinical picture. Maggie clasped her hands together. You mean, his symptoms? How much is he weakened, like amnesia or something like that? Dr. Warren nodded. Yes, partial amnesia is possible. Sometimes, I must say, there may be a loss of some brain functions, but it is impossible to say whether it will be or how long it may last. Many patients recover completely from this kind of injury, but there are no guarantees. We will closely monitor him and keep him partially sedated to give his brain a chance to recover, and we hope to see signs of spontaneous awakening within a few days. After that, the course of treatment will depend entirely on his mental state. Numb and scared, Maggie thanked Dr. Warren and returned to sit by RJ's bed, holding his uninjured hand in hers. Over the next few hours, her thoughts were to call her brother RJ David, inform his office, arrange a personal work leave, find out about home care nurses and whether they would need a wheelchair ramp at home, mixed with bitter self-reproaches. Her husband was almost killed on the highway. He may never fully recover. And she was away, drunkenly cheating on him with some asshole she didn't even know. What kind of insensitive, heartless, selfish fool was that? That day she prayed a lot, promised God a lot that she would change. She would be the perfect wife. She would be able to control her anger once and for all, if only he would return her husband to her. Let him be fine. She muttered it to herself like a prayer, almost like a rosary, as she sat holding his hand. Finally, at 8 p.m., the nurses sent her home. Really, Mrs. Renshert? You need to get some rest. Take care of yourself. There's nothing you can do for him here, and we'll call you as soon as he wakes up or something changes. She called David, and the next morning she and Angela were driving from Chicago and would meet at the hospital. She went home, forced herself to eat soup and a sandwich, and cried herself to sleep. And the next morning she cleaned up the house and threw away all the clothes after a drunken night. A dress, underwear, even shoes. It all ended up in a big bag and in a trash can in the garage. The next 3 days passed in a blur. She got up, went to the hospital, held RJ's hand, and when she was forced to return home, she left. David and Angela stayed all day on Sunday. They were kind and supportive, but had to return to Chicago to their children. They called every day, but Maggie wouldn't give them to them, since RJ's condition was stable, but he was still unconscious. No change are the cold words on his chart every morning. At about 4 p.m. on Wednesday evening, Maggie was dozing in an armchair next to RJ's bed when she was woken up by a noise. She looked, and RJ's eyes were open. He looked confused and seemed to be trying to say something, although it was impossible due to the tube coming out of his throat. Maggie jumped up and called the intensive care nurse. Then she stood where RJ could see her clearly and speak softly. "It's okay, baby, I'm here." She held his hand tightly. "Can you see me?" He nodded slightly, still looking very disoriented. "It's okay. You were in a car accident and you're in the hospital. You're okay, honey, you're going to be okay." She saw his face begin to relax a little and continued to speak. "You've been sleeping for a while and I've been here with you. David and Angela were here too. We all talked to you and held your hand." As she spoke, RJ's eyes trembled and then closed. He moved away again as soon as the intensive care nurse came in. Maggie excitedly told her what had just happened when she checked RJ's instruments and tubes. The nurse nodded and said, "Okay, that's good. He'll probably have a few more such short awakenings before he's strong enough to stay awake. I'll let the doctor know." Maggie was back in the chair, crying softly with relief. Over the next 5 days, RJ made rapid progress. He had more periods of wakefulness, and they lasted longer. On Friday, they took the pipe out of his mouth, and he was able to speak. At first, only a couple of words. His throat hurt a lot. But by Sunday, he and Maggie could chat for 5-10 minutes at a time. He didn't remember anything about the accident, only about driving down Highway 71, looking forward to a special evening with Maggie. On Sunday afternoon, he suddenly sat up a little straighter and said, "Oh my God, baby, I never made it home. You must have been so worried. Were you mad at me?" Maggie was afraid of this discussion, but she guessed what she was going to say. Her goal was not to say anything that could jeopardize RJ's recovery or his state of mind. "I was worried and angry at the same time, baby. But I knew you wouldn't miss our evening, so it had to be something urgent. After a while, I really got worried. And then when I got the news from the hospital, I came right away." She smiled at him. "I've been here many times since then." She reassured him about everything. He was on sick leave from work. His boss called every day and asked if there was anything he could do. She took a 2-week vacation from her job, where everyone was so nice and supportive. His medical insurance was paying the hospital bills. Everything was under control. 8 days later, RJ was transferred to a hospital for rehabilitation, and when he settled there, the doctors advised Maggie to return to work. She did this reluctantly, but RJ was looked after. He was getting better every day, and she spent 4 hours with him every evening. Friends came, talked, or played cards, and RJ quickly regained his mental acuity. All the neurological tests were very positive, and Maggie was looking forward to the day when he could return home, the day she had been waiting for and praying for. On Saturday morning, just 5 weeks after the accident, RJ got out of the wheelchair at the front door of the rehabilitation center, moved on crutches to Maggie's car in the parking lot — he trained every day for a week — and carefully lowered himself into the passenger seat. She was taking him home. The bandages were removed from his arm, and only a small one remained on his ankle, which would be there for 2 more weeks. The wound on his head was covered with hair that had grown back. The best news was from the neurologist. RJ's speech, writing, and comprehension skills returned to normal, and almost all of his memory returned, except for the accident itself. He was allowed to return to work as soon as the cast was removed from his ankle. Maggie had planned her day perfectly. When RJ settled at the kitchen table, she brought soup and a fresh Cobb salad, which she had prepared in advance. There was a bottle of white wine and some fresh French bread, and after dinner there was a bed. They were both damn horny. It had been over 5 weeks, and the only relief was RJ that Maggie had pleasured him several times while no one was around. She used her vibrator at home, but they both missed out on true love. "My God, do you think you're ready for this?" She teased him by pulling him out of his clothes and leaning on the bed, supporting his ankle with a pillow. "Maybe we should wait a little longer." And before he could answer, she disappeared into the bathroom, only to return a minute later in a very beautiful red floor-length nightgown. Wow! He replayed it in his mind for another hour, then finally took off his clothes and went to bed. He was exhausted, angry, and confused. There will be plenty of time tomorrow to sort things out. When Maggie woke up, it wasn't more than a second before yesterday's events hit her like a giant wave crashing over her head. She remembered last night and everything that had happened. She couldn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. But maybe she just lost her husband. Wearily, she went downstairs to make coffee, looking around in vain for signs of RJ. She took a shower, tidied up the bedroom, got dressed, and made herself breakfast, all the while hoping that RJ would come back or the phone would ring. Nothing. This is bad luck. Did she and RJ go dancing maybe once, twice a year? And of all the places they could have gone, it had to be millions. The night that damn Michael was there. She sat over a cup of coffee for another half hour, staring out the kitchen window, silently wishing RJ's car would turn into the driveway. Finally, around 11 a.m., she picked up the phone and called him on his cell phone. "Hi, Maggie." His voice was cold, distant. He sounded tired. Maggie swallowed, suddenly realizing that she didn't know what to say to him at all. "RJ, please go home. I know I hurt you, and Please come home and let me explain. There was silence on the other end of the line, and she rushed on. That's not it, what you must be imagining. I mean, I did something terrible, I know, but please, dear, it's not. I'm so sorry. Unwilling to do so, Maggie suddenly found herself crying, big sobs coming out of her. She kept the phone away from her so RJ wouldn't have to listen to them. Finally, he said, I'll be home in an hour, then we can talk. Without waiting for her answer, he hung up the phone. They were sitting in the living room, Maggie on the couch and RJ on the chair opposite her. Can I make you breakfast, dear? What is it? She asked him when he entered the house. But he shook his head and said, I ate at the motel. Let's just talk, okay? And now he was waiting for her to start. He seemed to her like a bored juror who had lasted too long. But she knew that behind that indifferent expression, he must be offended and completely furious. How different they are. When she was angry, she couldn't hide it anymore. She waved her arms and flew. Baby, Look, you know how much I love you, right? I've never... That's not what I want to hear, Maggie. His voice was harsh. He leaned forward, staring at her intently. You love me, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I get it. To hell with it all. She looked at him in shock. RJ never swore. Just get on with it. Let me hear it all and then I'll figure out what the hell I'm going to do with you. She nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. All right, dear. She sighed. It was only once. Once. And it was because of my character. She told him all about the day he had an accident. How she waited, got angry, called hospitals, checked the TV, and finally left the house in a rage. Without a cell phone, which she left in the living room. She told him about how she went to Ultra Mint, flirted, danced, and got drunk. I'm completely drunk because I haven't had dinner. And Michael took her to a hotel room. RJ sat quietly, motionless, listening to every word and watching her face. I was very drunk by then, dear. She spoke softly, sometimes looking down, sometimes directly at her husband. I wasn't even that angry anymore. I just got angry and, I don't know, embarrassed. When we entered the room, he began to take off my clothes. I knew we were going to make love, but it just seemed like it seemed beautiful. But when he started, he was too drunk to maintain an erection. He stuck it in me, but he kept falling, and he told me to put it in my mouth. She stared at the floor, not daring to look at RJ. I did, and it has become much more difficult. And then he fell asleep. She laughed bitterly. That's it, my big affair. It was terrible. She looked at her husband, seeing that he was staring at her intently. I pulled on my clothes, went back across the street to the bar, took a taxi and came home. I fell asleep soundly on the bed in my clothes. It wasn't until the next morning that I checked my answering machine and found out about your accident. She was calmer telling the story, but suddenly she started crying again. I'm so sorry. Her head was in her hands and he could hardly understand her. I was so angry. I was sure that you would support me after all your promises, and now I've ruined everything. She cried, and he sat and waited, looking at her. He was numb and furious. He was calm, but at the same time he was burning inside, as if something was burning his guts. Finally, she calmed down, wiped her face, looked at him. I'm sorry. Is this the only time? His voice was still calm, controlled. Is that asshole Michael the only guy you've ever made love to? It hurt her. She even got angry for a moment. Then she thought, well, of course he's asking me about it. No more than I deserve it. He's the only one, RJ. This is the only time since I met you something. No man has even kissed me. She waited, watching him look at her, then turned away, looking out the window overlooking their backyard. He suddenly stood up. I'm leaving. Take a walk, think. To leave you for a while. Startled, she nodded. I have to. Do you want me to cook dinner? I don't know. I'll call you. I do not know how long it will take me. Without saying a word, he turned around and left the house. She heard his car start and then drive away. She was sitting on the couch hugging herself, unhappy and very scared. For some reason, RJ decided to go to Chicago to see his brother David. He took a day off from work on Monday. His boss had been very understanding since the accident, and RJ was sure it wasn't a problem. He used his cell phone to leave a message for his boss on Monday morning, then called David and Angela to tell them he was coming. Finally, he texted Maggie, because he didn't want to talk to her, 2 nights at David's. I'll probably be back for tomorrow. Part of the meeting was great, even relaxing. RJ loved his nephews, who ran around the house with that wonderful, goofy enthusiasm that small children have. And he enjoyed that hour at the dinner table as Angela coaxed him to set aside seconds while she and David drank beer and talked about growing up, sharing some of his funny memories with Angela and the kids. But it seemed to David that RJ was puzzled by something, and when the two men sat down together in the office after lunch, RJ let it all come out. It wasn't that great, it hurt. David listened quietly with obvious sympathy. He had always liked Maggie very much, but he was well acquainted with her character. The story surprised and disappointed him, and he was angry at her for his brother. But David saw how it could happen. When RJ finished, David asked quietly, "Do you know what you want to do?" RJ shook his head. "It's too early. I know I love her. You know how happy we were, David. But I just can't stop seeing her in a hotel room with that asshole, naked, The whole scene is spinning before my eyes. I just can't get past it. How could she do such a thing? All I've ever done is work hard to make life worthwhile, a good life for both of us. And I love it with all my heart." David could tell he wanted to cry. They sat quietly for a while. The next morning, RJ talked to David one more time over breakfast before returning to Columbus. All RJ knew was that he wasn't ready to come home to be with Maggie yet. "I'm going to rent one of the apartments that my company reserves for visitors. There are 2 of them, and they are almost always empty. I can probably rent one on a weekly basis. Actually rent a place and not worry about collateral, furniture, and other nonsense." David nodded. "What are you going to tell Maggie?" "I really don't know." RJ sighed. "I'm just thinking. I do not know what will happen, but I need to be away from her right now. I know it's going to upset her, but right now I'm upset." He smiled ironically. "Practically everyone in the old Renshirt's house is upset." RJ returned to Columbus in the middle of the day. He went straight to the office, arranged to rent the apartment on an indefinite basis. The company would not need it for at least a month, and then headed home. Maggie's car wasn't there. Presumably she was at work. 45 minutes later, RJ packed 2 suitcases with clothes and his Doppler kit, took his laptop and some business papers and headed to the company's apartment. On the way, he stopped to leave a note for her. "Maggie, I can't be here right now. I live in one of the apartments of the company." Maggie came through the door at about 6:15 a.m., carrying 2 bags of groceries. She stopped to buy something for dinner, hoping that RJ would come. But his car wasn't there, and all her plans were ruined when she saw his note. She sat and cried right here in the kitchen, crying until she ran out of tears. Finally, she wiped her face and sadly got up to put away the groceries. She took the cutlets out of the freezer. She had never wanted to cook so much in her life, put it in the oven and went to the bathroom to wash her face. After dinner, without tasting it, Maggie picked up the phone. "Robert? Hi, this is Maggie Renshert. I'm really sorry to bother you at home, but I am..." She stopped talking and started crying again. On Tuesday after work, Maggie sent her husband an email. She was discussing with Roberta how to say what she wanted to say, and it took her more than an hour to get it right, although it wasn't very long. "Dear RJ, I know that I have done a terrible thing and offended you very much. I would give everything I have in this world to get it back if I could. I let my terrible temper get the better of me. That's why I've been seeing Roberta since you had the accident. Please don't give up on me and our marriage. If you find it in your heart to give me another chance, I swear I will never do anything to make you regret it. Being your wife was the best thing in my life. I love you, your Maggie." It made her cry just by rereading it. And out of silly superstition, she closed her eyes and crossed her fingers when she pressed the send button. RJ was angry and lonely, and he was sad. After a couple of lonely evenings in the apartment, he realized that he was in danger of going crazy. So the next evening, he joined a couple of employees at the local Saint Bar, Basil's, which they often hung out in. When they teased him, asking how he managed to get rid of the old ball and chain, they were still single. He just smiled and said, "My wife doesn't control me." He had absolutely no desire to tell them what was really going on. So he ate a burger and drank a few beers, played darts with friends, watched some ball games on TV, and went home to get some better sleep. His meeting definitely didn't solve all his problems. RJ thought it made him feel a little better. He didn't respond to Maggie's email. He let it run around in his head, rather than rushing to decide what to do. On Thursday, he sat down at his tiny kitchen table and made a list. The pros and cons of staying with Maggie. The list of pros was almost 4 times as long, but the items in the cons column were quite large. She cheated on me. Can I ever trust her again? How do I know that one day her temper won't get out of control again and make her do something else terrible? At that moment, his cell phone started playing and he saw a text message. It was from Maggie. Can you come to lunch on Saturday? We can talk or take a walk or whatever. I love Mem. RJ thought about it. Step by step, he realized. I don't have to decide if I'm going back to her, just if I want to see her on Saturday. He decided that he did and answered, I'll be there at 12. Over the next few weeks, RJ and Maggie got together several times, always at home, always when she invited him to lunch or dinner. They were restrained, friendly. Maggie quickly discovered that RJ didn't want to hear from her. I love you so much, darling. Didn't want to be told how sorry she was. Didn't want to repeat it all at all. Therefore, she stayed away from this topic. They talked about their jobs, about their nephews, and once even about possible vacation plans. Maggie was quietly excited. If RJ could talk about going to Aruba, he certainly wasn't planning on divorcing her. At least, that's what she hoped. And one day, Maggie cautiously brought up the subject of Roberta Simmons. By acting very carefully, she made sure that RJ knew that she saw Roberta regularly. She was beginning to understand better why she had character problems. The fault was not only her Irish blood, but also from the attitude in her family where she grew up. And as soon as RJ's face changed, he remembered the close connection between Maggie's temperament problems and her terrible mistake with Michael. She stepped back and changed the subject. As for RJ, he didn't know what to think. Several times when he was alone on the road or in the office at work, he was angry at Maggie for the unforgivable act she had committed and vowed to throw the deceitful ass away from himself. But he kept accepting her invitations, pretending it was mostly out of kindness to Maggie, or because she was an excellent cook and he didn't eat so well himself. And when they were together, he had to admit that he was having a good time. He always liked being around Maggie, and their low-key, casual conversations about everything in the world, except, of course, her adultery. They reminded him so much of the blissful early days of their relationship. He loved everything about her beauty, but also her laughter, her way of jumping up to interrupt him when she got aroused, only to apologize with a shy expression on her face, her interest in him and everything he said, her kindness and generosity towards people. Every time he left, he said, "Well, Maggie, thanks for dinner." And she touched his hand, kissed him on the cheek, and said, "You're welcome, dear. Thank you for coming." That's all. No pressure and emotional scenes, no pleading. It was much easier to say yes the next time she invited him. Every time they were together, everything became a little more relaxed, almost imperceptibly friendlier and more intimate. For her part, Maggie was just acting cautiously and hoping. But there were times when she feared the worst. It had been 5 weeks since that terrible night when they'd bumped into Michael in the cafe, the night her happy life had fallen apart. And while RJ seemed content to see her a couple of times a week, ready to eat and chat with her, he gave no indication of what would happen next. He didn't say a word about their future together, didn't let on that he was thinking about coming back, and didn't even let her gently direct the conversation to her love for him. She continued to see Robert, continued to invite RJ, and kept her hopes up, although sometimes it was just terribly hard, and she spent part of her evening crying quietly. On Tuesday evening, right after work, when she was leaving the CVS in the city center, trying to find her car keys, she heard a man's voice that said, "Maggie, is Maggie Sullivan really you?" She looked up, and there, dressed in a suit and tie with a neatly trimmed beard, was Eric Horsted. "Eric, oh my God, just look at you." Each of them took a step or two forward, and suddenly they hugged tightly, muttering at the same time, "What are you doing here?" And, "How are you?" And, "Do you live here now?" Eric was Maggie's only serious boyfriend in college. In fact, the first true love of her life, long before she met RJ. She and Eric had been together for 2 years and even talked about marriage. But he graduated a year ahead of Maggie and knew he wanted to work abroad. In fact, he devoted 3 years to the work of the Peace Corps in Madagascar. So, with regret, they said goodbye to each other, vowing to always be friends. For a couple of years, they kept in touch by mail and occasionally by email. Then the correspondence stopped. Maggie hadn't seen him for over 12 years. "Yes, I live in Columbus now. What about you?" I'm only here for 2 days at a conference on international food aid for Africa. Now I work for an NGO. I mostly live in Washington when I'm not abroad. She stepped back to look at him. He was so stylish, a far cry from the hippie-looking guy with long hair and a tousled beard she'd known more than a decade ago. Listen, if you're not going to have lunch, let's go to my house and I'll make us something to eat. It would be so great to catch up. Well, why not? I was going to eat with some of the conference participants, but I'd rather spend time with you. They sat in her kitchen, talking and laughing, while Maggie cooked chicken breasts, pasta, and salad. Eric had a lot of great stories and some wild situations that he encountered in Africa, and Maggie had time to remember everything that she once liked about this man. His energy, his sense of humor, and his desire to change the world for the better. What about you? I can tell you that everything is fine at work, but what about the rest of your life? Where is the happy husband who walks with these rings on his hand? He immediately realized from the pain on Maggie's face that he had said something wrong. Maggie, I'm sorry, what happened? She shook her head and quickly wiped away a tear. Eric, well, my husband is not here right now. We're in trouble right now and he's moved out. Eric was immediately worried. I'm sorry, Mags. Do you want to talk about it? She smiled at him. Not now. Maybe later, thanks. Let's just have dinner and you can tell me more about venomous snakes, midges, and everything else that makes life in Africa so tempting. They talked and laughed over dinner, finishing most of the open bottle of wine, and then Maggie made coffee and they sat down in the living room to drink it. The stories flowed on, but then there was a pause and Eric said, Not out of curiosity, Maggie, but can we talk about you? She looked at him and nodded. Well, do you remember how I've always been short-tempered? Eric laughed and said, It's not easy to forget, Maggie. Well, I got very, very angry and did something very, very stupid. And now, she began to sob. Now RJ is mad at me and I'm afraid I've really lost him. Maggie burst into tears, and Eric went to the sofa next to her, hugged her and let her cry on his shoulder. When she finally calmed down, she told him the whole story. What she had done on the night of RJ's accident, about his rehabilitation, their happy months of his recovery, and then the terrible night they ran into Michael. He and Eric talked when it was well after midnight, and as a true friend should, he was patient, kind, and responsive. He didn't try to deny that she had done something stupid, but he praised everything she had done since then to try to fix it, and he urged her not to give up. It sounds like RJ is a great guy, and it also sounds like he's holding his own. If he's still going to have lunch with you, he's not disappointed in you. Don't lose hope. She sighed and gave him a tearful smile. Thank you, Eric. You are a true friend. I can't tell you how great it is to see you again. She hugged him once more and stood up. Listen, it's very late. Why don't you just stay here in the guest room? It's rainy and terrible outside, and we both drank a fair amount of wine. I can order you a taxi in the morning. Soon she made Eric comfortable in the guest room, and with another gentle hug, they said goodnight. It was the next morning, Wednesday, when RJ woke up early. Something was different. He couldn't say what, whether he had had some important dream. If so, he didn't remember it, but it seemed to him that he had made a decision. Standing in the shower, the water was pouring over his head, and he caught himself thinking, to hell with it, I miss her. I'm tired of this lonely life, and I'm ready to go home and get my marriage back. As a man who thought things over, he was still arguing with himself as he dried himself and dressed. Did she do something absolutely unforgivable? Yes, but she openly admitted it and apologized over and over again. Do I think she'll ever do it again? No, I don't think so. And she tried everything she could to fix it? Yes, she was patient and loving. She didn't put pressure on me. She saw Roberta to continue working on her character. What else could I ask her to do? RJ looked at his watch while drinking coffee. If I hurry up and shave, I can be home by 7:45. It should be early enough to catch her before she leaves for work. I'll leave all my stuff here and I can come back and pack it tonight. With a smile on his face, RJ grabbed his wallet and cell phone and headed for the door. What he was going to do was nice. It felt right. Eric sat across from Maggie at her kitchen table while they drank coffee. It was 7:25. Did you sleep well? I've called you a taxi at 7:45, so you'll have plenty of time to come back and wash up before meetings. Eric smiled back at her. I slept great, Maggie, and I can't tell you how wonderful it was, this chance to see you again and catch up on what you've missed over the years. They talked a little more, and at 7:43, Maggie looked out the window and saw that a taxi was waiting. On the front step, Eric in yesterday's suit, but Maggie still in her bathrobe. They kissed and hugged for a long time. They agreed that they would now stay in touch by exchanging email addresses. They wished each other all the best, and he said again that he hoped she and RJ would be fine. Then, as he turned to leave, she said, "Thank you so much for your support, Eric." And she hugged him again. It was just two dear friends saying goodbye. But it didn't look like that, and certainly not the way it might have looked to Irene Dunstan, the widow who lived across the street. She was the unofficial gossip queen of the neighborhood, and it would give her great pleasure to share the news about Maggie's friend who was seen leaving the house early in the morning, clearly having just slept with a man. But by bad luck, at least for Irene, she left for Atlanta, staying with her youngest daughter who had just given birth to her first child. So there was no one who could see Maggie saying goodbye to her friend. Damn. RJ pounded on the steering wheel in desperation. It was 7:38 a.m., and his progress toward home was blocked by Ryder's truck parked in front of a store on North High Street. Traffic was stopped in both directions as only one car could pass on the road. That's what bad luck is. Now that he had made up his mind, RJ really wanted to see Maggie to inform her of his decision. In that case, he might have missed her. She might already be at work when he arrived. Maggie returned to the house and set herself a bowl of cottage cheese and fruit to eat with a second cup of coffee. She smiled to herself. It was a wonderful surprise to see Eric, and how nice that they were able to renew their friendship so easily. She really wanted to tell RJ all about it, and suddenly her happiness disappeared. She wondered if she would ever get a chance, if she and RJ could ever be together again. Don't give up, was the advice Eric and Roberta gave her. Well, she would do her best. She was surprised to hear the sound of the front door opening, and before she got up, RJ was walking into the kitchen and looked worried and angry. "Damn traffic," he said angrily. "I wanted to be here by 7:45 and I was afraid that I would miss you." "What's wrong, RJ?" she asked, a little worried. He looked so upset, not at all like the calm, slightly detached man she had been with for the last few weeks. Looking at her worried face, RJ laughed. He shook himself and smiled at her. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm not mad at you. I'm just annoyed because of the traffic jams. Listen, can I have a cup of coffee? I want to talk to you." "Of course," she replied and poured him a mug, automatically bringing milk and sugar. They sat down and she looked at him warily. When he saw her look, he smiled broadly again. "Why wait? Honey, I want to go home. I want to be here with you again." She stared in amazement and then smiled and began to cry. "Really?" she said, and tears were rolling down her cheeks. "Are you coming back to me?" He nodded and realized that there were tears in his eyes too. He got up, walked around the table, lifted her to her feet and wrapped her in his arms. They held on to each other tightly. "I just miss you," he said in her ear in a hoarse voice. "I don't want to be away from you anymore." Then they both cried a little, standing together in the kitchen, swaying slightly, hugging each other. After a few minutes, she whispered, "Baby, I'm so sorry." "Shh," he said, stroking her hair. "I know, honey." He pulled back a little to see her face beaming with tears, but smiling broadly up at him. "Listen, do you think you could be a little late for work this morning?" "Oh, baby, yes," she exclaimed, and a moment later they were holding hands and heading for the bedroom.